Welcome back to our Revitalist podcast. Today, we are here to change the narrative of mental health. I am Catherine Walker, and I'm honored to be here with two adolescents, Gabriella and Kyle. Thanks for being here, guys.
Of course. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So, talking about adolescence and mental health, right? This is a really big play that really it's personal to me. I think it's personal to adolescents too, on how the whole tone is changing, right? So, I just turned 40. The tone for me hearing about mental health is changing for me as well. But you guys are seeing like an influx of changes, but then not only are you all seeing them personally, you're also having to hear like what your parents know, what your grandparents know, and what you're seeing. And as it's evolving, it's so different like through the generations. So, what do you all see? Kyle, if you want to go first, what do you see in school that it seems common to you with mental health? Because when I was in school, mental health didn't exist. We didn't talk about it, right? People just disappear if there was something with mental health. But now it seems like there is a narrative in school. So,
Yeah, so there actually have been a lot of efforts towards mental health in my schooling. So here in Collier County, they do a thing called Connect for Success. So once a week, I think, we go into like a classroom and they give us basically a video about mental health strategies, what to do if you're feeling overwhelmed with school, if you're anxious, if you're feeling like symptoms of depression, kind of like the basic steps of what to do. And they also do provide therapists there, the nurses as well. There's a lot of mental health resources at the school. And after talking with my dad specifically about it, there was no like counselors when he was growing up, no therapists, no nurses to like talk to you about your mental health, or there was no collaborative effort to kind of actually talk about things that were sensitive to somebody or that could actually hurt somebody in the way that they'd want to take it back out on themselves. And so when I found that out, I was just very shocked because I feel like that is a pretty normal thing, especially growing up, because it's always been that way. Since school, they always did like the bullying talks, and then that kind of led to the mental health.
yeah, you're right. Yeah, we used to do bullying and drugs, right? Say no to drugs and then bullying aspects. One thing with that, right, that I've noticed with adolescents and in general, right, that we're a very reactive society. So it's, when this happens, call 911, go to a nurse or whatever else. Do they, and actually I'll send this one over to Gab. So Gabriella, when people talk about mental health, kind of like what Kyle's talking about, is like we have these supportive features around mental health. But being my daughter and being very well aware of mental health, are there times in life to where when you have certain stressors at school that you feel like it's more common for you to have symptoms of anxiety or to have symptoms of depression to where you're more likely to look out for it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, cause kinda like whenever, like, a big test is coming up, like, everyone's, like, freaking out, and, like, some people don't even study because they get so, like, nervous about it, even though that won't help them at all.
Right. So there's certain situations instead of people becoming like depressed people or anxious people or people who are wanting to have like self-harm, it's like what we need to do is evolve into a situation to where it's like, okay, finals are coming up. At this time, I know that I'm going to be at higher risk for not sleeping, maybe having negative thoughts, maybe having anxious symptoms, maybe feeling depressed, maybe feeling like a failure, right? So all these things that typically we would treat in mental health, like, well, here's a pill, right?
Mhm.
That would help to treat thoughts of self-harm or anxiety or depression. Instead of us actually giving you like medications to suppress these things, if we can start looking at ourselves and saying, wait a minute, of course there's a lot of stress around me right now. Of course I may have trouble with sleeping or I can't turn my thoughts off. Or if I have thoughts of wanting to hurt myself, why am I having thoughts of wanting to hurt myself? And a lot of times when people have those thoughts, it's because they feel out of control in certain situations. And when we have a lot of stress, that stress that we put on you all constantly as children growing up, like we look at it as like, no, like this is normal. This is what you all need to be doing, right? Is having this stress to where you're studying all the time. And you all don't know, we don't teach you how to turn your brains off or how to relax or how to be peaceful. We just push you. So it's like, how do you know from a standpoint as a student, how do you know when too much is enough to where it's like, okay, I need to take a mental health break?
So, at least in my personal journey, it's been a lot of having independent moments to myself. I'm a very collaborative and I like to be very social person. And for me, if I can sit in my brain and just write what I'm thinking out, I can really quickly figure out if I'm doing too much, if I'm stretching myself too much, and where I kind of need to remove it a little bit. I don't think they teach that though. That was something I had to go find the information on. And I'm lucky that I am that type of person who is willing to go search for that information, go search for ways that I can improve my mental health and that I can improve my being. And I know so many people who, especially guys, that are not capable of doing that, or they don't want to do that, or they just don't understand it. And then you see them kind of fall into the more normal, like high school, college trap of making decisions that shouldn't be made at a young age and just getting yourself involved in bad things.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah. No, that's a good explanation for sure. And the other thing too is like, drinking. I'm sure you've been around it because you're a little bit older than Gabriella. I don't know her complete story. I don't think she's been around it. But, it's one of those things too, right? So one thing I've noticed with adolescents especially, and this goes on right into your adulthood, and this is something really big I think to listen to. But like it seems that there's higher stressors between the ages of like 11 and 13. And then there's also bigger stressors when you guys are teenagers, when you're moving into bigger categories of life, right? So it could be when you start driving, when you have your first big breakup in a relationship, when you graduate high school and you start transitioning to that next role of life. Like your identity is then changing. But what you'll notice too sometimes, and especially with high school, and you guys are going to see this with your peers, if you start drinking, if you start smoking weed, if you start doing drugs, and even just one time, right? Some people, you'll start to notice that some people can do it one time and drop it. Other people will do it and it will become more consistent in their patterns. And then other people will eventually become addicted to these substances. And unfortunately, what we tell people is with the whole mental health aspects, we will tell you, well, if you remember the first time you took a drink, if you remember the first time you took, a pill and you remember where you were standing, well, you're wired to be an addict. But what we're seeing is that when people, especially in your all's age, because you guys are in a very impressionable age, when you all do these substances, and most of you all will at one time during your life, a lot of times it's because that substance that you're taking is actually suppressing what you're feeling. So a lot of people who start drinking, right? And if they start drinking consistently, they're actually medicating themselves typically because of anxiety, but that anxiety that gets medicated then starts this whole cycle of depression. And the thing about substances, when you start taking them consistently, you don't start making normal emotions. So your brain gets attached to the object, and that's where it starts making emotions is with the object. So when you all are teenagers and you're evolving constantly through so many lifespans when you're a teen, then you all are making all these new emotions. So if you start taking substances, then your brain will actually stop maturing emotionally. So when you get off these substances, your brain starts trying to catch up, but it's really, really hard to catch up because as you know, since you were 13 until you're 17 now, you've matured, like probably, quite a bit year over year. And Gabriella's still getting there, with all that stuff too. But, she's starting high school. You just finished high school. So that's something to really keep in mind is like protecting your mental health because during these stages, high school, you get everything thrown at you
mhm.
and you're just at a very, very fragile place. And if you start getting down that negative cycle in life, it's really, really hard to break that cycle because your base pattern's gone because you guys are just establishing your base pattern. So what would you all do? Like say if you, or actually, Gabriella, I think this is a good one for you because this one, when I heard this, I was kind of blown away. But it's common talk, I believe, for kids today to talk about their purpose. And what would happen if they didn't have a purpose? And would they kill themselves if they didn't have a purpose? So, do kids tell me a little bit of a narrative on the commonalities that's talked about these days?
More just like they think that if they die that no one's gonna remember them and it nothing like, they don't really see the point in living.
But this is common, right?
Yeah.
This is like common narrative. So I
Yeah.
come from, when we didn't talk anything about this like at all ever, right? And if you cut yourself, we looked at you as like a weirdo, right? But people who cut themselves, they do that because they're stimulating some of catecholamine release, which actually makes them feel better. So it is a negative pattern, but it's a negative coping mechanism. But now kids are talking about it's like we've normalized mental health so much. Now everybody's like, well, how would you go out? Is that can you give more
So
emphasis to that, Kyle, since you guys are from 2 completely different states?
honestly, like my perspective on as far as like mental health, our age, talking about death, a lot of people do it.
Mhm.
It's actually pretty common. I think the talk around death has become a lot more common and what people's actual objective is in life and everything like that. I've never talked to somebody about what we do if we didn't have a purpose, like if we kill ourselves. I think like I don't know, that maybe that's just like my friend group, but I have talked to people about why they'd want to kill themselves and they genuinely think deep into it, which is the part that, scares you and actually makes you go out and reach out to somebody. But I've had people describe to me how they'd want to, exactly who they'd write letters to, and in almost like a fantasizing way,
Mhm.
and it's that's a little creepy, and it makes you feel uneasy, and there's especially when you care about the person, because for somebody to open that up with you, it's usually, like, in my opinion, from what I've seen, is it's either a cry for help or they, like, really trust you, and usually it's a mix of both, and when you feel that it's not just words that they're saying, it's that they actually, like, feel it, it's gut-wrenching, I guess, is a
Yeah,
good word to say,
yeah.
and it's just weird that that's become normal.
Well, and I think it's hard too, right, to differentiate because some people can talk about death and it's just like, talking about buying a shirt at the mall versus other people may talk about death and they may feel like this emotional connection. Because what happens a lot of times with people with death, right? And this is across the spectrum. When they start thinking about death, it becomes very, very negative. And that negative thought process, right? And it duplicates. So it could be, you know what? I am a lot of stress on everybody around me. You know what? If I wasn't here, they wouldn't have to worry about me. And starts to become this like really, to where your brain almost sometimes starts talking you into why you would be better off dead, right? But the brain, what they've proven is the brain doesn't know right from wrong, good from bad, all in the way it's trained. So the more we're bringing up these negative thoughts, the more the brain's going to put it in its own narrative. So the biggest thing, like what I like to tell people, and most of your adults don't know this, right? Is with suicidality, they think that it's directly related to depression. And they will tell you that. Most people will be like, if somebody kills themselves, they'll say, I didn't know they were depressed. But there's actually very little correlation to say that depression actually it leads to loss of life. So the way that I always look at people and I'll tell them, if you ever have thoughts of hurting yourself, so 70% of people have thoughts of hurting themselves at some time during their life, 70%. So if you don't have that in your lifespan, you're actually abnormal. So if you have that thought of hurting yourself, typically it's because it's a negative coping mechanism and you're trying to get out of the situation, right? You just want it to end. So your brain just goes to, hey, I feel out of control right now. So your brain's going to try to over control everything because your brain always tries to balance. So I always tell people if you ever have a negative thought come up, step back and be like, okay, wait a minute. Why do I feel out of control right now? Because my brain's trying to balance it and to try to give me a controlling statement. Because if you've ever been around people who have ended their own life, and I've been around that. If you've been around those people who have done that, they'll be very, very chaotic for a while, and you can just tell they're struggling and struggling and struggling. And then all of a sudden, they're okay. They're very peaceful. It's like the best you've seen them in like 10 years. But what happens is they made the decision that they're going to kill themselves So where they have felt out of control for so long and struggling in their own mental health, they've made the decision they're going to kill themselves, which helps to balance that control. So they feel okay with it. So, but what I'll always tell people is when you have that thought and you feel okay with like killing yourself, I'm like, what's on the other side? How many people have you talked to that have actually killed themselves? Did they get stuck in their own hell that they're in now? Like, we don't know. And we always look at it like the grass is always greener on the other side. So what would I'll ask this to you, Gabriella. What would if somebody came up to you and say it like Kyle's had these conversations, right? With kids talking about letters or whatever else. What would you do as a peer to one of your adolescents if they came up to you and just said, yeah, I've got a letter? Like how would you, or would you be able to differentiate if they were being serious or not?
I guess on the attitude and, like, how they responded, like, if they seemed, like, kind of, like, joking, I wouldn't take it too seriously, but still seriously, 'cause, I mean, if they had a plan, then they still had to think about it, so
Right. And that's one thing. So from a mental health perspective, they'll tell you, if somebody's talking about it and it's called passive, right? So people are like, I just want to be dead. Like that's a passive thought. But if it's somebody who came up to you and said, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it tonight. I've got letters and this is how I'm going to do it. If somebody came up to you like that, what would you do then?
I would probably try to get someone else involved, 'cause I don't think I could handle that by myself.
And that's the next best step, right? So the more specific that people are in their plan, then the more you should go reach out to an adult or somebody to say, "Hey, there's something that they told me and it's kind of worrisome," right? Because maybe they are joking, but maybe they don't understand, right? A lot of people who kill themselves and, especially teenagers, they make dumb decisions and they don't think they're going to die from it. One kid that I had grew up with, he ended up shooting himself in the stomach, and he didn't think he would die from a gunshot wound to the stomach. He just didn't think about it, right? But yeah, that's what happens is you make these decisions, and some of these decisions you can't rebound from. So what would you all like to see, like in the system, in your support system, as a high schooler? What would you think would be beneficial to you?
I think they need more people who genuinely care. I think there needs to be a genuine effort towards, first off, prevention. Not when you get the signs, this is like what you're looking out for. It should be like, why are these kids, in my opinion, I feel like it should have been, why are these kids getting depressed? How can we avoid these things that are making them depressed? And then if we do have those abnormalities, then how do we treat them in the best way possible that they don't feel that they're excluded? I'm not the expert to like say how that's done. I think from what I felt there is I felt like I didn't have enough connection with staff until my mom came in and she was the nurse there.
Okay.
So I ended up making connections there. But before that, I felt very isolated from the staff that they were more of like an enemy than a friend, you know? Um, and to teach people how to deal with everything going on in their lives and be able to like actually organize it and be able to run it through their brain and like process it. Because if you can't put everything together, it's chaos. And if you can't put your schedule together, you can't put your room together, you can't put your car together, you can't keep your mental health together. It's just it's impossible.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Your brain learns to stay out of control at all times, to live in chaos, right? And that becomes its consistent normal. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. Like, so like if you guys had like, big exams, or right before summer break, right before winter break, just to change, right? To where maybe they would come in and do a hour-long talk on, hey, here's some stressors that you might see with these tests. Here's some stressors you may see at the holidays, right? Because everybody looks at the holidays as like, oh yeah, they're great. But what if this is the first holiday that you've experienced to where you had lost a grandparent? Or something significant, right? So it's like, okay, let's go ahead and prep you for this. So, because these are stressors that you might see. And then that way, when you see them, you're like, oh, okay, I've seen this before. Now here's some of the strategies they told me to use. Because right now, we just look at you all and say, all right, hope you do well on your grades. We want you in a sport to do physical activity, right? But we're not giving you these preventative measures. We're just saying, if you start decompensating, then let us know if you start having these negative things, and then we start treating you like a patient. So what would you say, Gab? What would you say would be the best supportive things for you? So you just came out of middle school. What do you think would be the best support for you and your peers? Not to be reactive, not to say call 911, go to a nurse if they want to hurt themselves, but up front to give you guys additional support.
In the high school, we do not have a health class, so that would probably be useful. So,
Like a mental health, like what about in
yeah.
middle school? In middle school, did they talk to you about like mental health stuff?
A few times a month. We didn't have an actual, like, certified class for it, but sometimes it would be in wellness class.
Would it be more so if you have these feelings of wanting to hurt yourself, this is what you should do?
Not exactly, like, they would, like, bring it up, but they wouldn't exactly, like, say this well, actually, there was a lady that came from an operate like, a organization to, like, stop preventions, and we had a whole class about it, and it went really well. Like, people were actually, like, interactive, but
And I think that's the cool thing with
yeah.
you all right now too, right? Is you all have so much power. It's because you have one, you guys are way ahead of us on most of the tech stuff. But two, you're always in the loop, right? With all the social media and all that stuff, to where you all have huge influence, not only on yourself and your peers, but your parents and your grandparents. Because even when you're 90 years old, your mental health is still evolving. Because the way you all think right now, being 14 and 17, it's going to be very different than the way that you think when you're 90. But our brain is still actively evolving. So I think the more you guys can get involved, because both y'all have a really good head on your shoulders, but the more you all can get involved with like hearing this stuff and saying, hey, look, this might be a high risk time for us to talk about these additional stressors. And if we teach each other these coping mechanisms that are actually positive, instead of us going and like cutting ourselves or shooting ourselves or whatever else, then, then we can kind of look on how we can rebalance that and we can choose healthier pathways instead of just expecting like, to go take drugs or smoke weed or,
Mhm.
become alcoholics kind of stuff.
So I'm going into college. We're both going into new
Mhm.
phases of our lives. How can we manage that and manage our stress and the whole change of everything going on? What are some of the best ways we can kind of go into that and be in a very learning stage?
Yeah. I think that's great, right? So one thing that I talk to people about is we all go through changes in life to where our identities change. So both of you, your identity's gone now from being you're no longer a middle schooler and you're no longer a high schooler, right? So you're evolving into a new identity. So people will tell you it takes about 6 months to effectively evolve into this new identity that you have. And if you look at like what identities say, so whenever I talk to people about identities, they typically will go back to boy to girl to boy kind of thing. But what's in our identity is a lot, right? So it's your social class. It's how much money you're making, how much money your parents are making. Where do you live? What do your family dynamics look like? What sports are you in? What kind of support systems do you have? So from high school and from middle school, both of you have lost these things. They're gone. So you can't go back to being a high schooler ever again in your life. And when you evolve to this next phase, you've got to build the next phase. So what I tell people, right, you've got your conscious thoughts and you got your subconscious thoughts. Conscious thoughts is about 5% of the decisions that we make in life. Your subconscious thoughts is the 95% of the decisions that we make in life. So when you start your path, your new path now, and when you start your new path, when you get into something that's new, you may walk in, you may feel anxious, you may be scared, you may want to lead it, you may want to isolate and pull back. Who knows, right? That's going to be your subconscious kind of leading you then. And I tell people that's our simple, stupid, strong is our subconscious, right? So that's when you see light, when you hear your sounds come in, just different colors may stimulate a different memory. So you're going to be in a very, very vulnerable state for about 6 months. So when your new phase in life, I'll tell people, you too, Gab, but when this new phase, give yourself about 6 months, right? So she's starting as a freshman in high school. So from August until maybe February, look at yourself like, hey, I'm still kind of in this fragile period. And I just need to make sure that I'm supporting myself well enough. So if you start to feel that like, man, I'm not sleeping or I can't turn my brain off, it's like, okay, hold on. Let me see what coping mechanisms I have now to where I can learn peace and calm. So I talk to people a lot about peace and calm. And this is something that we don't teach anyone ever. So peace and calm only come from the present. So if we can learn to sit in the present moment, we can feel peaceful and calm. But we just automatically think that you're normal if you feel peaceful and calm, but you're not. You've actually taught yourself those coping mechanisms. So if in school, if you start feeling anxious or depressed or I can't get out of bed, usually we're living either in the past, like I want to go back to high school, and you're going to see this. You're going to see people who graduate from high school and that was the best years of their life and they just stay stuck in high school for the rest of their life. Those people live in the past, right?
Mhm.
But then you're going to see other people who live in the future, and those people develop anxiety. Because anxiety is us trying to control what we have no control of, and then our brain will start duplicating that. So what we have to do is we have to learn to teach ourselves to live in the present. And if you learn to teach yourself to live in the present, it's like, okay, I don't know if people know the serenity prayer and all this other stuff, but it's basically a prayer that says that you're going to have the wisdom to know better or to like what to let go and what to keep. And then you're going to be able to accept it. Right. So if it's something that you can truly control, you're going to work on that and then you're going to change it. But if it's something that you can't control, then you need to learn to let that go. And if you can start teaching your brain these strategies, the brain can actually learn to live in this space. But if it can't learn to live in that space, then you're going to keep chasing everything for the rest of your life. Right?
Mhm.
So like an example for me is like I don't know what is good enough in life. Like I will never feel like I'm good enough. That's me. And I'm sure a lot of people are like that. But my brain doesn't know what good enough is. And I think it was Jim Carrey I saw the other day was talking about some type of award. And I guess he won 2 really big awards. And he said, well, on this third one, though, I know that I'm probably going to feel like I'm good enough. And he's right. He's not. It doesn't matter what goals he hits in life. In his brain, he's never going to be good enough. So me personally, I've accepted that. So I'll strive and I'll push as much as I possibly can until I'm like, okay, I need a break. I need to go on a vacation. I need to go stare at a wall. I need to go watch a movie or I need to go take a nap for 6 hours, right? But it's recognizing you push until you can't push anymore, but you don't push when you start crumbling in on yourself. And that's what happens a lot of times is a lot of us push and we push so hard, we stop remembering what normal feels like. And then when you start not feeling what normal feels like, you start not trusting yourself. And then you start feeling like you're out of control. And then you go over to a family member and you're like, well, I don't know. I made a bad decision. What do you think? And then you start putting that control that you don't have on yourself and the trust that you don't have for yourself anymore onto other people. And then you start losing your identity. So what you have to be careful about in these different phases of life, you want to build your identity and they're new. So when you get married, you're going to have a new identity. When you have a child, you're going to have a new identity. When you get a dog, when you move homes, these are all changes in your identity. So the only constant that we have in life is change. So what we have to do is we have to learn what our pillars are. So your pillars are typically it's 3 basic things: love, safety, and trust. So it's like how do you love yourself and how do you show love to others? How do you know that you can trust yourself and how do you know that you can trust others? And then safety, how do you know that you feel safe and then how do you know that you feel or that you're safe and how do you know that you're safe around others, right? If you have those 3 basic things, those 3 little things will help you to start building your identity in that new role. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but did that help?
Yes, that helps a lot actually, because I'm the same way you are. I'm the type of person who will keep pushing myself until it's literally impossible for me to keep going. And then when I get to that wall of where everything will start crumbling in on me, I go, I can push harder because I know I can. Like I have it in me and I just don't feel like taking the break because for me, I feel like I'm a very flowy person. If I'm in a flow of work, I'm gonna work really, really hard, even if that's past my boundaries. But how can I balance that a little bit better for myself? Because I will push myself until I can't.
Yeah. So there's 2 things, right? One thing's discipline, right? So discipline is getting up. And it doesn't matter. Like, I used to be at the hospital at 4 a.m. in the mornings, and I was so tired. And I remember crying on the way to the hospital. I was exhausted. And I was going to have to do a pediatric open heart that morning. And I was just, it was a lot. But I showed up, right? Because I knew I had to.
Mhm.
Um, if you're one of those people who are like me, who you can't measure, like you're never going to be good enough, they always tell you not to compare yourself to others. But one thing that I have to do is to compare myself to others, right? Because other people, I won't say normal, because we all have our different categories of normal. Other people work Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, 8 hours a day, and they have a very successful, fulfilling life. My brain doesn't work that way. So, like you probably, I can sit down in a chair and I can go 16 hours if I need to. I can sleep 4 hours if I need to, because when I get focused on a mission, I'm going to execute the mission,
Mhm.
right? But what I'll do sometimes when I start to feel like, okay, wait a minute, my thoughts aren't as clear. Um, am I just like doing this for the redundancy of task, or am I actually in my zone? And so a lot of times I'll look at that. And if people are doing 8-hour days, say I've already done 8 hours that day, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. I'm going to do one more hour and then I'm going to be off the rest of the day.
Mhm.
So I make myself take those breaks because I know I can push. But if you start to compare yourselves to others that way, it will show you like, wait a minute, here is the base, and this is how much more I'm doing over the top. So therefore, you can kind of measure it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to a degree, that makes sense. I'm personally like mentally trained because of all of like the schooling efforts. Like, don't compare yourself to other people. I think it's been wired in my head a million times, the don't compare yourself to other people, compare yourself to yourself and what you do. And because I compare myself to myself, that's where my difficulty would be. So, where can I retrain my brain so that way I can think more of like, okay, people do 8-hour days. I need to remind myself that I just did a 9. I'm good.
Right, right. And I think that's it, right? It's your data points. So you have to put things down on a list so you can see them. Because if you don't see them, you can't measure anything. So if you put it down on a list to where you can actually see it, then you can start comparing it, right? So if you do, if you're doing 50-hour weeks, like 50-hour weeks is fine, right, for most people. But 50-hour weeks over time, you do have a higher risk of burnout. And what burnout means is you start getting sloppier a little bit. You start getting more emotionally enmeshed, right? So you start feeling like you're becoming the business, which is or whatever career that you're doing, which is fine to a point until that becomes your identity. Because I've also talked to CEOs and such who have built their identity in this business for the last 30 years. Well, now when they go to try to retire, they don't know who they are, right? So what you have to do along the way is you have to kind of differentiate. It's like this is you building this path, but where are you building yourself, right? And that's the piece of like the whole emotional intelligence thing. And so you have emotional intelligence and then you have intellect. So you have your EQ and your IQ. In life, we only look at IQ. We don't necessarily look at our EQ. So meaning that with your emotional intelligence, you're going to be able to start to identify when you're having symptoms of ADD or ADHD or depression or anxiety or insomnia. A lot of times we don't even have the ability to identify those things because we just keep pushing. But if we can stop and be like, okay, wait a minute. Like me personally, like I wear this ring that measures a lot of my data points. So therefore I can just go back and look at like when it says like sleep quality, pay attention, you know? So I go through those different things and I'm like, okay, all right. So I go back to a base that shows me what quote unquote normal is. So therefore I can see, okay, wait a minute. Even though I feel like I can do it, if my heart rate variability is all over, not as consistent as it needs to be, if my REM sleep's off, like then even though I feel like I'm getting there, my body is showing otherwise. So I think that's the difference too, right? Is you got to look at, you've got your emotional, but then you also have a physical capacity. And a lot of people from the physical standpoint, you know, you'll see people who have pacemakers, right? Your long distance runners, they end up getting pacemakers a lot of times. And even though they felt like they were okay to run 100 miles a week for 10 years, their body showed otherwise. So I think that's maybe one piece to look at, is when you're pushing yourself, try to have that physical reflection to where, what is your heart rate doing? What does your sleep look like? Because if you're perfect in the green, you're keeping up with yourself. If you're not in the green and you're kind of in this like all over the place, or it's saying pay attention, then you're pushing yourself too physically hard, and you need to focus on that recovery so you can continue to build the way you need to go.
You mentioned a lot with like your physical health and your mental health kind of
Mhm.
collaborating with each other in many ways. I don't have like your little
Yeah.
brain,
Yeah.
but what are ways that I can roughly track those things and where my body metrics are if I don't have things like the ring or like a Whoop or like an Apple Watch or whatever?
Right. I think it's figuring out what is your consistency, right? So, for a child your age, there's going to be a recommended amount of sleep that you should get. There's a recommended amount of caloric intake and activity level. So maybe start with those three things, right? Diet, exercise, and then activity. Or I'm sorry, diet, exercise, and sleep. So if you look at those three things and you're keeping up with those three things with the schedule that you have, then more than likely you're going to stay on track. Because what they're seeing now, and this is really cool, this is a project that I'm working on, um, mental health. So we look at all this like activity in the brain. They're actually seeing now that the activity in the brain is not a direct correlation to mental health. They're seeing it's actually your cardiac status that has more of a direct correlation to mental health. So if you're starting to feel like say you stand up and you feel lightheaded, that's a vagal response. So your heart rate could drop a little bit then. Or if you're sitting there and you feel like some people get like a fluttering in their chest, or they'll feel like they can't catch their breath. And, so it's always good to know how to check your pulse. But if your pulse runs really fast all the time, that's actually showing a sign of abnormal catecholamines in your body that's making your heart rate too high. So if you have a consistent heart rate between 60 and 100 all the time, you're probably okay. But if you're, sitting there 120, 140 beats per minute, then that may show some abnormalities there too. It's cool, isn't it?
That was really cool.
Thank you. Full of all kinds of interesting things. What about you, Gab? What do you want to add to this?
We're just like if like someone will get like really like upset, they'll just like make like a joke about how they want to like kill themselves. So that just kind of normalizes it a lot. Where even if they said I want to kill myself and they actually meant it, they probably wouldn't even take it seriously.
And I think that's a big, right? That's a big education piece that we need to really try to figure out. Because unfortunately, suicide, loss of life, whatever you want to call it, it is becoming very normalized. And this is a fact that I always tell people. So if you have a first degree relative, something for everybody to keep in mind. If they lose their life by taking their own life, then their family members have a 40% increase in actually killing themselves because somebody has normalized it in their family, basically saying, well, I did it. So that's something to think of, like from a kid perspective, right? Because when children, they don't understand like how big of an emphasis they have on all this generational health above them. And a lot of parents, when they lose their child, like they decompensate, right? They'll be gone the rest of their life. They never come back to you. So that's something to think about too. It's like, if you or one of your friends, and that's always a really good statistic, I think, is to say, hey, if somebody's like, hey, I want to kill myself. It's like, hey, if you kill yourself, one of your family members has a 40% increase of killing themselves too. And a lot of times when I say that to people, they're like, oh, hold on, right? Because they think they're taking themselves out of the picture. But over time, I think if we can learn better coping strategies, and when I say coping, do you know what I mean when I say that? Coping mechanisms, coping
Mhm.
strategies. It's steps, it's healthy steps to take instead of just steps to take to make the situation go away. But the more that we can look at it and say, okay, wait a minute, what's my stress level like? And adults, a lot of times they don't even know how to measure their stress. So I'll tell them, I'm like, go make a pro and con list. Pros, what's helping your stress right now? Cons, what's making it worse? And, the more we can put mental health down on paper to where it makes sense to us, then the more we can actually use that as a reference guide instead of saying like, oh, it's all out of your hands. Oh, it's your genetics. Like you have no control over your mental health. All of that is not true. Do genetics have some play? Absolutely. Genetics have play in all kinds of stuff. But the more that we can identify these things, the more we can stop them from getting worse. Because what happens with mental health is if it gets triggered, it starts cycling. If it starts cycling, a lot of times it will keep cycling until it just goes away on its own. And we don't know how to stop it sometimes. So the more we're aware of ourselves, the more that we can actually, be preventative and not only help ourselves, but help our communities around us.
You said that there's a difference between IQ and EQ, your emotional intelligence, and like I'm gonna say like book smarts basically.
Uh-huh.
And that kind of I'm building upon the fact that you said writing it down, writing your mental health down is important for your brain to process. Do you think that if we started at a young age trying to implement emotional intelligence and trying to teach kids how to understand their emotions a little bit better, do you think that would allow people to understand and not have to translate it onto paper, for example? And that way they actually just speak the language of their emotions and not have to have that translator?
Yeah. I think all that should start in like kindergarten. Yeah, absolutely. Because what's happening now, right, is say if I get angry, right? Anger is a very normal emotion. And typically I put anger a lot with anxieties. Because we're trying to control something, right? A lot of times with anger. Um, but what do we do with anger now? If somebody gets angry, we're like, what's your problem?
Mhm.
You know? And they don't necessarily have a problem, but they're trying to, their subconscious or whatever is trying to voice an opinion. And we don't look at it that way. We don't look at like what's making you angry, what's making you sad. Instead, we're like, you cry too much. Let me give you a pill to make you, cry less. Are you crying less? Okay, well, great. That sounds great. It sounds like you're doing great. But you're absolutely right. The more that we can teach people how to walk with their brain instead of looking at it like it's ill, then the more that we're going to have the whole community change.
What do you think would be the steps to implement that into schools?
I think, well, one, I think you have to teach your teachers, right? Because when you're talking about feeling isolated or that with them, right? So teachers are not taught how to integrate effectively with students. They're more so taught what do you do if there's an emergency. So if we get teachers and staff and admin more comfortable with, hey, this child's crying, instead of telling the child to stop crying, why don't we try to figure out what the root cause of this is? Because this is like, I tell people all the time with emotions, emotions aren't real, but they're like a warning sign, right? Because I can't pick up my anger and throw it out the window. I have to learn to deal with something that doesn't feel right that nobody else can tell me about. So if we're able to teach the supportive areas around it, and then they can actually start integrating this on a daily level. But that will be a big project, right? We should get the politicians involved with that one.
I I strongly agree with that. I
Yeah.
think mental health push for younger generation is it's it's become a lot more popular in recent years, but I still think it's misdirected in many ways. And I think you have a very unique and cool approach to it.
No, thanks.
So
Yeah. But yeah, I think, like thinking about that because I've not really thought about it, but wouldn't it be cool, right? If you had people at the beginning of each school year, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, every school year and say, okay, these are the bigger times that you're gonna have stress and they can talk about it, right? So you can sit there and talk to first graders about like, I don't know, having a math test, with
mm,
10. And it's like, okay, but if we talked about all these things preventatively and then we gave them support things up front and then expect everybody's gonna do okay, but then here's these additional measures behind, that's how you get your comprehensive system. Because right now we're just like, call us if you need us,
yeah.
you know?
I think if you kept it up front, it would help normalize it because a lot of the issue is, especially from speaking from like a guy high school perspective, you're not sharing those emotions. You're not really talking to your boys about like, yo, like I feel sad right now. Like you're not really doing that.
Mhm.
And so I think if you normalized it and made it okay for not just guys, but everybody to be upfront with their emotions and be able to talk to people, I think that it would discourage the whole, like, I feel out of place talking about it, and I kinda wanna know what you think of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's different, right? I think your men and guys, a lot of times they'll come in and they'll say, "I don't feel right." So if they don't feel right, I think that's something that you have to try to help identify because a lot of times they just don't feel right. Females specifically, they'll be more quote unquote dramatic sometimes, right? So I think that if you're able to start identifying some of those different pieces with the males, the way males present versus the way females present, and then, guy on guy talk about it, girl on girl talk about it, and what that really looks like. I think that would be a huge difference because you can talk the guy talk, I can talk the girl talk, but they're very specific. It's like even if you have a heart attack, men have very specific symptoms of a heart attack versus women. So they're just different, right? So it's like if we can, you're right, but if we could look at those different pieces, even at the beginning of the school years for the male sex as well as the female sex, and everything in between. Then that's how we can start supporting those respective entities. Yeah, for sure. Well, Kyle and Gabriella, I thank you for being here with me today. And I think hopefully people have learned something about this podcast today with changing the whole narrative of mental health. If you liked what you saw, please put a check for a like or comment below. And please subscribe as well. And hopefully we'll bring you some amazing content in the future.